The American position would change, but not in the direction the British had hoped. Excuse me. Although many Jews would have preferred to settle in the United States or Western Europe despite immigration restrictions, the Zionists demanded their immediate relocation to Palestine, using, as the Americans suspected, the refugee issue for their own agenda to gain a Jewish state. Because neither the British nor the Americans would immediately compromise, the situation drifted long enough or more determined among the Zionists to force the issue as they turned on their former patrons and took matters into their own hands. Two groups, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, and now even the Haganah, underground Jewish army, increasingly resorted to violence against the British in a series of attacks and reprisals. British installations and personnel became targets of savage assaults, culminating in the most ruthless incident of all, the Irgun's destruction of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, July 27, 1946. The blast killed 91, including 41 Arabs, 29 British, 17 Jews, and 5 others. Enraged, the British forbade renewed Jewish immigration as they said they would not yield to terror. Nor could the Zionists retreat, and as the more radical gained the initiative, Chaim Weizmann, the old father of the whole thing, and the moderates lost influence. Since the extremists refused to work with the British in Palestine, they now sought to remove and replace them altogether through further acts of violence, understandably. The atrocities of the Holocaust had unified many in their resolve to gain an independent state for national survival, but the fact would be it would be at the expense of their greatly weakened British host clearly demonstrated the changed nature of the relationship. Britain had become the enemy. When Arabs and Jews rejected another British plan, and Truman would commit to nothing offensive to Jews or Arabs throughout most of 46, British morale sank further. Truman's Yom Kippur speech of October 1946 appeared to totally undermine British policy, and it did the rest. He leaned toward partition, which allowed immigration, and stood against the idea of a unitary state, which did not. Having no stomach for further bloodshed, the Labour government rejected General Montgomery's plan to execute British military will on Palestine forcefully or militarily. Instead, they heeded Churchill's call to abandon Palestine, which made much more sense to an electorate hardened now against both Zionists and Arabs alike. Under public pressure and utterly frustrated, the British turned the case of Palestine over to the United Nations in February 47, and cognizant of Arab and American reaction, did so minus any recommendation for or against partition. One thing for certain: since 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, the British have been fairly consistent in advocating Palestine as a unitary binational state. When partition occurred, the British decided to let the United Nations take the responsibility and the blame. Formed in April 47, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, known as UNISCOP, endorsed partition, which, true to form, the Jews accepted, and now the Arabs rejected. And no wonder. Of Palestine's 10,000 square miles, 1,270,000 Arabs were to be allotted 43% of the worst land, while 608,000 Jews to receive 57% of mostly fertile country. Unquote. Interestingly, this proposal was far better than one devised by the Jewish Agency in 1946, which gave the Arabs even less. The final UN plan presumed the result of a lot of pressure, provided a formula tailor-made for disaster. Even if the Arabs had agreed to partition, they could never accept this one-sided formula, which only added insult to injury. But the Arabs, including the Arab League, who had always believed the case for Palestine as an Arab state to be self-evident, presented their point of view in no certain terms. Quote, by legitimizing the Balfour Declaration and the mandate, this in essence stated that the claims of the Jews, the majority of whom have been in Palestine less than 30 years, were equal to those of the Arabs, many of whose ancestors had lived there for hundreds of years. Unquote. The Arab decision to give nothing and the Zionist position to take whatever possible can only lead to armed conflict. Had the Americans and British resolved their earlier differences and jointly enforced a more equitable solution of Palestine, things might have gone differently, minus bloodshed. In the end, the British without additional resources could do little else, while the Americans who had the means would do little more. Thus, one of the lingering and still unresolved tragedies and conflicts of the modern era was about to unfold. Since the Soviet Union also supported partition as a means of gaining influence and what might become a Jewish state of Palestine, The Americans, as well as the United Nations, have urged the British to remain until the end of their mandate in 1949. No doubt the British preferred an orderly withdrawal and dignified transfer of power, commensurate with their international obligations. But alas, the Ergon struck again in July 47 and forever altered Palestine's political landscape. In retaliation for Britain's execution of several terrorists, identified terrorists by the British, the Ergon kidnapped, mutilated, and hung 2 British soldiers and booby-trapped their bodies. Despite American and international outrage against the horror of this insane act, the greater outrage of the British public forced the government, now in process of withdrawal from India in 1947, to follow suit in Palestine, the mandate be damned. On September 20, 1947, the government made its decision for final evacuation of Palestine, set for May 15, 1948. Meanwhile, in retaliation for the Ergon's actions, Bevan prevented the ship Exodus, very famous incident, the Exodus and its cargo of 4,500 Jewish refugees from landing in Palestine to be returned instead to refugee camps in Germany. The British now looked little better than the Nazis. While the Ergon British victims had international sympathy, the Jews who had suffered the atrocities of the Holocaust had more. After this incident, little support remained for the continuance of the British in Palestine. As a result of Bevan's callous handling of the Exodus situation, the Zionist cause won the day in the court of the world opinion, while the Arabs became lost in the shiro. Consequently, on November 29, 1947, the United Nations voted 33 to 13 in favor of partition. Britain, as anticipated, voted to abstain. At that point, despite the concern of the Americans and the United Nations, who offered little help, the exasperated British threw in the towel. The Labour government, having committed 50,000 pounds, 80,000 troops, 20,000 police, since the end of the war's end, now to no avail, resolved to maintain their commitment to the May deadline 1948 only. Moreover, being shot from both sides, the government chose to execute their pullout in such a way as to prevent further British military and civilian casualties. The British decided to leave it to the United Nations to enforce the partition after their departure, and in the interval to distance themselves as much as possible from sporadic Arab-Jewish clashes which killed hundreds. In view of that decision, the Ergon's ruthless massacre of 250 defenseless old men, women, and children in the Arab village of Bir Yassin, a very famous incident, an event which Jewish neighbors condemned, as well as an Arab attack killing 77 Jewish doctors and nurses on the road to Tel Aviv the following day, proved the low point in the saga of the British retreat. Angered, frustrated, British officials decided against the traditional transfer of power, and instead, one of the most exasperating, humiliating retreats in British imperial history, simply evacuated Palestine May 15, 1948, abandoning Jews and Arabs to their own devices. Historian Elizabeth Munro concisely notes, quote, "It consigned to chaos a territory that it had taken on as a sacred trust for civilization." I'm going to end with that and turn this over to my colleague.
Thank you, Bob, for this exhaustive account of a relatively short period of time in human history, just 30 years. Thank you, Herb, for inviting me to act as a respondent. And as a, yes? Closer? Okay. I see my role as a respondent not to repeat what just been said, as impossible in the first place, but to see if I can highlight a few themes that might be worth thinking about. And as I was listening to Bob, there were three themes that came to mind. One is colonialism, imperialism. The second one is modernity, modernism, and related to that also nationalism. I want to start with the colonialism, imperialism, and I think one of the lessons to be learned from this account of just 30 years of history is that imperial powers only serve their own interests. Never mind the whole civilizing mission of the British Empire. It was not. It did not civilize. The history of British colonial rule in India, Africa, and the rest of the world is littered with terrible, terrible developments. And so, in that sense, it's actually not surprising that when Britain took over Palestine and Jordan as a mandate in 1949, that their policy there was primarily driven not by the interests of the people there or the interests of the people who were hoping to come here, but by their own interests in the context of maintaining an empire at a time when it had already mostly run its course. Because of course, World War II played a significant role in undermining the British Empire, but it's not that the empire, the people of the empire, were sitting by waiting for the British to leave. The British faced resistance in the imperial system throughout their colonial rule. The various rebellions in Africa, the various rebellions in India, are all examples of the fact that the indigenous population of whatever Britain ruled were not, in effect, happy with that state of affairs. So in that sense, it's important to remember that Britain was not, or should not be construed as quote-unquote an honest broker, or somehow interested in the long-term viability of whichever empires or whichever territories they controlled. So that's, I think, a crucial thing to keep in mind when thinking about the Middle East. I want to focus on sort of the notion of modernism here, and that is really the European, not just the British, but the European notion of imposing territorialism on whatever territory they controlled. The idea of drawing borders, the idea of creating state forms that are modeled on the European idea of what a state ought to be like. That's another theme that we see in British imperial history. We see that happening in terms of the mandate of carving up territories, pieces of land on the basis of their idea of who ought to have and who ought to not have pieces of land. And that goes right into what I would call the idea of nationalism, which is really a 19th century phenomenon. And it grew out of, again, this European notion that every territory ought to have its own particular people. And as we see this today in the United States in particular, where we use the word nation and state and country interchangeably. That notion that there is a piece of land that belongs to a particular identifiable group of people is a myth. A myth in the sense that there are about 10% of the countries in the world where that actually works. The vast majority of the world is not a national home to an identifiable national group. And yet we see again this attempt by the British to create these kinds of structures replicating European models of rule in the territories that they controlled. And there's, of course, a certain form of, what should I say? I don't want to use that word Orientalism because it's so loaded. But the civilization, the civilizing mission, the idea that Britain and Europe is sort of representing civilization against this bulwark of barbarism, that also fuels into this notion of the rightfulness of their particular rule and so forth. And so I urge us to actually think about these ideas and take Bob Harrison's information about what all happened into this larger context, because I think it helps us understand that nobody actually really wanted to listen to the people on the ground, be they Jewish or Arab. The British were not interested really in developing a viable system that would survive into the future. Now, they were pushed in many ways, as the account that you gave, but I think it's important to understand that there was no deep-seated sense of coming up with a just solution. The fact at the very beginning there were 3 different promises made during World War I should be a dead giveaway that the British were pursuing primarily their own interest. So I'm going to leave my comments to that because I think it's time for you to ask questions. I think there's a microphone up there if you would like to, or there's somebody, is there a microphone runner?
Michael?
Yes.
Could you just identify yourself and
Okay. I'm Michael Niemann. I'm an adjunct professor of international studies here at SOU. I'm not a Middle East specialist. I'm an Africanist by training. So I have spent much of my time studying the effects of British imperial rule on many peoples. There is somebody back there. If you speak loudly, maybe we can hear you. Okay.
The comments that were made about the act of attacking totally British, etc., has to, even though it has to be condemned, has to be taken in view of the atmosphere and situation there. And just to remind you that his body was formed right after 1939 with the white paper of the British that disallowed the immigration of Jews coming from the Holocaust, and actually Exodus wasn't the first case, but one of many that preceded, that British forces were forcing out Jews, not allowing them to immigrate to Israel, okay? And that was the reaction of an extremist group still, okay? That's the first comment I would like to make. The second comment regarding the actual attack on King David, rightfully so many were killed there. However, we also have to know that the SL was giving a prior notice of several hours to the British, where they planted bombs there, and actually begged them to evacuate the hotel. And the British ignored it altogether. Sorry? Well, I'm finished. Thank you. One more comment. The third thing is that if the Palestinians were agreeing to any of the partition plans, whether what is Peel Committee or the UN resolution, they had about 45% of the population in the Jewish territory. So, given the demographics, in a decade, they could be a majority in a Jewish state, according to that. So where is this oversight, or short sight, if you will, of the Palestinians to do that?
Thank you. Did you want to respond?
Oh, I'll just get up.
But please use the mic. Some of us are getting old.
King David Hotel. I'll address that issue. Yes, there was a warning issued to the British government. Nobody believed it. It's like issuing a warning to the Titanic that submarines are going to sink you if you sail into the war zone of World War I. Nobody believed it. Everybody ignored it because it hadn't been done before. Nobody expected that something like this was just going to be another blow-up. So they ignored it, and they paid a price. Titanic ignored it. They paid a price. That's the way history goes sometimes. Just do this sort of thing. It doesn't justify it. It's the important thing. It doesn't justify that type of killing. Indiscriminate killing of civilians. Not to blame. Okay. I'm done. Okay? I'm going to grab a cup of coffee. Excuse me. I need this badly.
All right. Further questions, please. Yes.
Well, I have a comment. Thanks, sir. As the talk started, say 10 minutes ago, I thought I would be asking right now, what book might I look at that would make this clear? And now I feel like to understand it, I would have to get a master's degree in it. And I don't know. I just want to make that comment and hear what you might say about it.
I think your assessment, maybe not a master's degree, but I think it is really useful and important to consult multiple sources. I don't think there is the definitive history of the Middle East that you could just take the book and say, now I know what happened. I don't think that's a fact. So yes, I would encourage you. And I think Bob Harrison might be a better source of which books you should be consulting.
Okay.
In the meantime, yes, I'll take a question back there.
I'm assuming that all of us here are very much interested in peace. And if that's
And if that's the case, I ask you plain and simple, how do you, in good faith, sit down with your opposition and talk peace when they look you in the eye and they say you are a son of a pig and an ape and every one of your people should be swept into the sea, man, woman, and child? How do you sit down and have a cup of coffee like that? The professor was talking about the Crusades, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. There are Arab festivals today, parades, commemorating battles of hundreds and hundreds of years ago. If it's your mindset, it's your mindset. How do we get people to say, no, you're not the son of a pig or an ape, and I don't want to sweep your children and your families into the sea?
Well, I think the nature of your comment just suddenly took hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people and put them into one box. They are all that way. And I think the first step might be actually to think that neither Jews nor Arabs are one particular way. And I think that would be a first step, on both sides for that kind of recognition. That there are, among Jews as well as among Arabs, there are opinions that are extremist, but there are also other opinions. And I think that's a particular strategy to employ. And that gets me back to this notion of nationalism. I think nationalism in many ways is hindering rather than aiding a resolution of the problems in the Middle East, as well as elsewhere, actually. Because nationalism enforces a particular notion of who we are. And it only is defined who we are in opposition to somebody or something else. There's a built-in automatic oppositional idea there. And I think getting over that notion of all of us are like that, when we all know, of course, that we aren't, I think is one of the first steps.
I appreciate all the comments that are being made, and yours particularly, sir. But if we could stick to the facts, Professor, Martin Luther is the one who made those comments about the Jews, and Martin Luther had a great deal to do with the Crusades and the destructions of Jews. So if we could keep the factual issues straight, it would be helpful.
Well, speaking of facts, Martin Luther lived about
400 years after the
400 years
Crusades.
after the Crusades. Are there comments or questions?
I just want to say, I think one of the interesting things that struck me from both presentations is the role of not nationalism, but of internationalism and the kind of weak institutions that we have had up to this point, and as we've seen in the history since 1948, the inabilities of the various parties to come together and try to resolve the issues. So I have a question about what you might think about some other form of international effort that could somehow do something in the future beyond what we have seen repeatedly happening over these last 50 years.
Well, neither the League of Nations nor the United Nations should be blamed in any particular way, because they are as weak as their founders wanted them to be. So this is not like here's this grandiose institution that somehow failed. It worked exactly as the founders of it wanted them to be. I mean, it's not an accident that the League of Nations just sort of took colonial territories and just divided them up among the colonial powers. Class A, Class B, and Class C mandates is what they were called. Class A was Palestine, Arab, Class B was Africa, Class C was everybody else. There was a continuation exactly of the policy as it had been practiced. And that's, of course, because the people running the League of Nations were the very colonial powers that had to gain. I mean, as a matter of fact, during the negotiations, the American representatives were deeply upset that Britain and France were dividing up the world by grabbing pieces of territory that were Ottoman and German and otherwise to add to their colonial empires. The same thing with the United Nations. The United Nations is not an institution that has the capacity to do the kinds of work that we wish it would sometimes do, because the way it is structured.
Yeah, I want to say just one other thing. If you look at the League of Nations and later the United Nations, you have to remember this is the first attempt at this kind of creating an institution that would try to guarantee a general peace, that would try and prevent offensive wars, border disputes, try to handle this sort of thing. And it had never really been done before. So it really is an attempt. I mean, people could point back to the old Concert of Europe and so forth, and those were issues, but nothing quite like the League of Nations. And then and everybody thought they were crazy at first. Remember, Wilson proposed the League of Nations, and the 4 European representatives at Versailles thought he was crazy. This is not going to work. It's not going to, but they made it work, but they limited what it could do, as you mentioned. But without either one, where would the world really be right now? A lot of things have been prevented by the United Nations. A lot of things were prevented by the League of Nations. A lot of things passed through the floodgates with both of them. But at the same time, the attempt was there to try and preserve order, international order. It had not really been done that well before. It's been attempted, but nothing like this had ever been set up. It's considered ideal, if not absolutely loony, to do it.
Let me add to that. The only non-European members and non-American, Latin American members of the League of Nations were Ethiopia and Japan. And when Ethiopia was invaded by Italy in 1935, the League of Nations says, whoops, well, there was that. The United Nations that actually voted on this partition plan had, what, 54 members? Again, mostly the countries that were also in the League of Nations. The vast majority of the world was not even yet independent. So, in that sense, you have a sense that these institutions were not really representative in terms of internationalism. And I think, generally speaking, I am suspicious of hegemonic powers. Have always been, whether they're Britain, whether they were the Dutch before, or whether they're the United States afterwards. And I have a sense that problems don't get solved by hegemonic powers to the satisfaction of the actual people involved. I'll leave it at that. Any further questions? We have probably another 7 minutes.
I have a basic question. Is there an opportunity to get Bob's paper that he...
I'll leave that up to Bob. I have a microphone. I'm trying to
Here.
Sure, I can run a copy for you.
Okay. Anybody interested?
That's an easy answer.
Anybody interested in this paper, talk to him afterwards. Don't raise your hand, talk to him.
I'm sure
Take the microphone, please.
how the Ottoman Empire managed this huge area.
Hey.
Hello.
I'm sorry. How did the Ottoman Empire manage this area for hundreds of years and gave up, I guess, their control, after the
Right.
First World War? Sort of curious, never got a good answer.
Okay, the Ottoman Empire had been around in pretty much in force since the Ottoman Turks captured the city of Constantinople back in 1453. By 1517, the Ottoman Empire from southeastern Europe had conquered also all of the Middle East, with the exception of Persia and modern Iran. They gave little in the way of self-government to any of the conquered territories. So you have a very large, in this case, Arab population living under the Ottomans for centuries, without much political power within that situation. And so you have really, when the call came, when the Sultan, the last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, gave a call to the Arab population for calling a jihad against the British who had come into the region, nobody listened. Because, in fact, the Ottoman treatment of the Arab population had been very marginal at best. I mean, it was not well accepted, and the Arabs wanted to get rid of the Ottoman suppressors as they saw it. One thing that does come to mind, because you mentioned it earlier, and that is certainly one of the greatest Ottoman figures at that time was Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk was a general in the Ottoman army. He defended the Ottoman Empire against the invasion of the British and the French at Gallipoli. He was successful in that. He then commanded military units in the Middle East under a German officer by the name of von Saunders. And at the very end of the day, when it looked like the British and the Arabs were driving the Ottomans out of the Middle East, he pulled his troops back into what is today the border of mainland Turkey, and he said, enough is enough. And what he did was say, we're going to become a Turkish nation state. We're not going to control anybody outside of our own borders. So what he did was buy into the European state system at that time to create a modern, a secular state of Turkey, women with full rights to vote and everything else. It became a very, very interesting model of sorts. In many ways more democratic than what had gone on in Europe, and proclaimed a nation state. The League of Nations, however, decided they had already divvied up the Turkish Empire in their plans, and they planned to give the Greeks, for instance, most of Western Turkey because of their participation in the war and so forth, and under the Treaty of Tabriz. When the war ends, Greek troops came into Western Turkey as far as Izmir, that is midway through the Turkish peninsula, and then Ataturk took charge and said, I don't know what the Sultan's got to say about this, but I know what I have to say about it. We're driving all these people out of here. And so what he did was take the initiative, and after 6 months, he defeated every army in Turkey, and then forced a new treaty on the League of Nations called the Treaty of Lausanne, which creates the official Turkish national state. The Ottoman Sultan resigned. He was the last. Muhammad VI was the very last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and a Turkish republic took over at that time. It still is. Okay. So that's what happens to the Ottoman Empire.
Maybe one more question.
And just to add to that, this notion of Turkish nationalism also relied on the denial of Armenian nationalism. Right? So to this day, it's illegal to even. Turkey does not let you talk about what happened to the Armenians. So again, there's that notion of exclusion as well as inclusion.
But there's a good historical way to do that, and that is you blame the Ottomans. We're not the Ottomans anymore. We're modern Turks. We're not the Ottomans.
Maybe one more question or comment?
Like the last one? Okay, let me find my phone. Okay, thank you so much, both of you. And I hope we all leave here to work for internationalism. I did hear when Professor Niemann started to speak, I sort of moved into I thought I moved into a different point of view. And so, Professor Harrison, I would like to ask you, when I did listen to you, I was moving into a British take on things, and I was feeling that, gosh, the British created all these opportunities, and societies weren't buying it. They had some good reasons to, but lost opportunities. And as Professor Niemann started speaking, I thought, well, maybe not. So anyway, Professor Harrison?
Yes.
The British.
My question is, Professor Harrison, is it surprising to you that I was getting a British take on things from listening to you?
Oh yeah, because they controlled the situation. That's why I did it.
Well, listen, we have been empowered with
enormously helpful amount of information. And I want to thank Professor Harrison and also Professor Niemann for bringing out salient points. We're going to take a 15-minute break, or let's make it a little closer to 10-minute break, and help yourself to coffee or tea, a little refreshments, and be back in your seats a little before 11:45 when we'll resume.